what about consumption? Again, what about income in terms of, inequality in terms of consumption? Well, there, the distributions of consumption is distributed, consumption is distributed more equally than income. Here's the basic order ranking. The most unequal distributions are with wealth. Income is still quite distributed quite unequally, but the least inequality is observed with consumption. At least that's what most economists seem to believe. And here we're looking at a chart that's a little difficult to read, but frankly it's worth the effort because it really does kind of show us differences in consumption patterns across different income brackets or groups. What these little lines are showing is how much different households spend on food, apparel, housing, a whole bunch of consumer services, goods and services, and then a bunch of non-consumption uses of income. Taxes, charitable donations, education, and financial flows. A fancy word basically saying savings and investment. In each case, this upper portion of this triangle is indicating households that are in the highest 20%, the top quintile in terms of income. The middle little triangles are showing how much is spent by the people right in the middle of the income distribution, the middle 20%, the middle quintile. And finally, the lower triangle in each little figure here is showing the lowest quintile, the poorest households, the bottom 20% in terms of income. Now, if you look across this chart, one thing that jumps out at you is that the people who are in the top quintile spend more on everything. They spend more on food, housing, transportation, healthcare, entertainment, miscellaneous expenses. They pay a lot more in taxes. That one let's stop to mention right now. All this stuff about the rich being undertaxed may or may not be true. Again, I'm going to leave that to you. But if you look at what percentage of their income winds up being taxed away, or how much they pay in total taxes as a share of all taxes paid, well, the rich basically are taxed at much higher rates than middle income and the lower income families. That's certainly true with federal taxes, federal income taxes, and it is true also if you look at broad measures of taxation. Now, we can also notice here that there's, again, two cases where wealthier families, higher income families I should say, are spending a lot more in taxes and also in financial flows. There you see it very obviously. In other words, families with higher incomes simply save a lot larger portion of their bigger incomes compared to middle and lower income families. In fact, lower income families have an inverted triangle. They're spending more than they're saving. They're spending more money than they're actually saving, and they're going into debt, basically, liquidating assets or taking on more debt. Now, as we look across this, one thing that jumped out at me when I looked at this graph for the first time was how, even though higher income households spent more money on pretty much everything, a lot of times the differences weren't particularly striking. In other words, middle and even sometimes lower income households don't spend that much less than households that appear to have much higher income. And you can see that when you look at these numbers. These numbers are the ones that are very, very telling. Here you have the lowest fifth. The household income in the bottom quintile, a little under $10,000 in 2006 before taxes. But household consumption was $18,153, close to twice as much. In other words, if you look at the bottom fifth of households in terms of income, they actually consume a whole lot more than their income before taxes. Now there's a whole variety of reasons why that's the case. Part of it is they may be going into debt. Part of it is they may be getting help from family members. But also there's probably a whole lot of income that isn't showing up here. It could be welfare payments, it could be other subsidies, other government payments. But one way or the other, a lot of times, not all of the income of people at the bottom 20% is being captured here. They're spending a lot more than they appear to be, than it appears possible. They're spending more than their income, substantially more. Now, if we look at middle income households, their income were something close to $45,000. And if we look at how much they were spending on household consumption, $34,000. A little under half as much. Their income's well over 4 times as high, but their consumption less than less than twice as much. What about the top 20%, the top quintile? Their income's close to $150,000. Their household consumption expenditures, a little under $70,000. Clearly, they were spending a lot more than middle and lower income households. But if you look at the ratio, something really surprising happens. They were earning close to 15 to 1 compared to the bottom quintile. But look at the ratio of their consumption spending to that in the lowest 20%. Roughly, 3.5 times as much consumption. Consumption increases 3.5-fold, but income increases 15-fold. So, what's that telling us? Well, it's telling us, among other things, that consumption appears to be distributed a lot more equally than income when we compare lower to higher income brackets or households. Now, actually, consumption per person is distributed far more equally than those numbers suggest, because there's simply a lot more people per household in higher income households as opposed to lower income households. In the lowest quintile, there's 1.7 people per household. The middle household, a little over, well, actually it's close to 2.5. And in the highest income households, you have a little over 3 people per household. So there's a lot more people to spread the higher income between, or to spread that higher level of consumption between than there is here or there is here. Once we adjust for differences in the average size of the households and look at consumption per person, well, these numbers become a lot more equally distributed than they first appeared. Consumption per person in the bottom quintile, 10,600 plus, a little under 10,700. What about consumption per person in middle income families? $13,700 per person. And finally, those at the top 20%, $22,500 plus. Now, compare the numbers. 10,700 roughly, 13,700, 22,500 roughly. Here you're talking about a little over 2 to 1 in terms of consumption per person in the top 20% versus the bottom 20%. Now that's still an important inequality. It does suggest that people down here are living much more frugal lives and probably sometimes really struggling in life. But at the same time, that kind of distribution of consumption is far more even than when you look at income per household, and even income per person. So basically, that's really kind of telling us that consumption really is distributed far more equally than income, and again, that's distributed far more equally in turn than wealth. Here we have a quote from a couple economists, Donald Brudose, whose name I'm absolutely butchering, sorry about that, and Mark Perry. And here's the quote. Quote, "One underappreciated result of the dramatic fall in the cost and the rise in the quality of modern basics is that while income inequality might be rising when measured in dollars, it is falling when recognized in what's most important, our ability to consume. Today, the quantities and qualities of what ordinary Americans consume are closer to that of the rich than they were in the decades past." What these economists are pointing out is something else that's going on with consumption. That basically a lot of creature comforts and frankly a lot of necessities have gotten cheaper, have improved in quality over the last several decades. In essence, a lot of working class and even poor people's wallets or incomes simply go a lot farther in terms of their purchasing power. And one more thing. Goods that at one time would have been considered luxury goods are coming onto the market faster and faster. They're going from being luxury goods that can only be afforded by the rich to being things that are afforded by virtually everyone. That's something else that isn't really captured by these consumer statistics, but it does suggest that there's something else going on that's a little hard to quantify, but something nevertheless is probably pretty real, and suggests that consumption is becoming more and more equally distributed over time. Here we're looking at the consumption spreads faster today, looking at a variety of different household technologies and goods and how they spread. Just to give you a couple examples of a complicated chart, if you go back to 1900s and look at how telephones spread throughout the entire population, here we're looking at the percent of households that had a particular technology or good. Telephones, well, it took a long time for telephones to spread, to become almost universal. And we're talking about the old style, really old style telephones here, landlines. The point is at first, when telephones were first introduced, those were really luxury goods. They were very expensive. Only very well-to-do families living in large cities could afford to have them. But eventually they got a whole lot cheaper and they got to be something that almost everyone owned and used. You'll see more generally when you look at a variety of different technologies that were introduced in the early 1900s. Automobiles, stoves, radios, refrigerators, electricity, and so forth. A lot of these kinds of technologies started out as luxury goods, things that only wealthy people could afford, and it took decades and decades and decades for those things to spread where they became very widespread consumer goods that were readily available by the masses of people, including the poor. But then you look at more recent introductions, especially with electronic equipment, and those kinds of goods and services, things like, well, even clothes dryers in the 1960s spread much faster than automobiles or telephones or stoves. Air conditioning spread much faster. But then you start seeing much faster spreads with things like microwave ovens, VCRs, internet access, cell phones. Remember that scene from Wall Street, the original Wall Street, where Gordon Gekko is holding, well, it's not a cell phone, it's a portable phone. And it's this huge thing about the size of a brick. Back then that was supposed to illustrate, wow, this guy was an important guy. He could afford to have this fantastic technology. He could talk to people while he was driving around in his limousine. Well, today we laugh at that because our telephones are so much more functional, so much cheaper, and so much smaller. But back then, you had to be a rich bigwig to own that phone. Notice that movie isn't that old. Within a period of roughly 20 years, we went from telephones being extremely expensive, I should say portable phones being extremely expensive, and very limited in their quality, to being something that almost everyone has today. Young and old, rich and poor. Cell phones, smartphones today. Well, we laugh at Gordon Gekko for his brick-like phone, but today we have little gadgets that work a whole lot better or a whole lot cheaper, and almost everyone owns one. That is something that's, well, again, making consumer goods and purchasing power more widely available to the masses of people, suggesting that in many respects, consumption is becoming more and more equally distributed over time. Now,